So my name is Gabrielle Sanborn and I will be covering anthrax. So it's a bacteria. Its phylum is Firmicutes. Class is Bacilli. Order is Bacillales. Family is Bacilliaceae. Genus Bacillus. Species Bacillus anthracis. So some characteristics of this is that it's gram-positive. It's endospore forming, rod-shaped. The width is 1.0 to 1.2 microns with a length of 3 to 5 microns. It can be grown in a nutrient medium under aerobic or anaerobic conditions. Usually is aerobic though. Can be found in the soil and is an obligate pathogen, which means that it needs to become the disease before it can be transmitted. Some history about this is that they think in around 700 BC is to have originated in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Some scholars think that during Moses' time and the 10 plagues of Egypt, anthrax may have caused what was known as the fifth plague, described as sickness affecting horses, cattle, sheep, camels, and oxen. And you will find out why in the next couple of slides. So some famous scientists like Robert Koch used anthrax as a study specimen when making the famous Koch postulates. These are things that we covered in our last exam. So he isolated and grew Bacillus anthracis in pure culture and injected animals with the bacteria. Using what he observed in this study, he described how the microbe he injected into the animals caused the disease. From this study, he also was able to determine the life cycle of the anthrax bacteria. Pasteur also helped work to create the vaccine for anthrax. And then around the 1950s, a vaccine for humans was made. It was tested on a group of goat hair mill workers. Volunteers were either given the vaccine or a placebo, and the volunteers were then followed for a 2-year period. This study determined that the vaccine was 92.5% effective, preventing cutaneous anthracis. So who is affected by this? Anyone can be at risk of exposure or encountering anthrax, but the risks for the contraction is greater for certain people versus the average. These people include, people who handle animal products and livestock, so veterinarians, some lab researchers, travelers, mail workers and handlers, and possibly military personnel. So anthrax affects herding animals like cows, goats, sheep, and horses. This is why they think it was part of the plagues back in Egypt, because it affects herding animals. They contract it by inhaling or ingesting it in areas where soil is infected with anthrax. There's also possibilities of resources like water or plants that can be infected that can cause disease with the animals. Overlapping effects is that it's not contagious like the flu or the cold, but people get infected when these spores enter the body and then become activated, producing the illness. This can happen from exposure to spores or being near animal products that have the spores. So there are actually 4 types of anthrax, and then how they interact with the body also applies to the type. So cutaneous is basically enters the via cut or sore. This is the most common as well as the mildest case. So some symptoms include a raised itchy bump that develops a sore with a black center, and swelling in the sore and nearby lymph nodes, so like the neck area. So there is also in gastrointestinal. This type is contracted by eating undercooked meat from an infected animal, so that can happen, with like cows. That's a big consumer meat. So if it gets infected and you eat it, then you contract the gastrointestinal version, and symptoms of this is nausea and vomiting, swollen neck, like we talked about the lymph nodes earlier, sore throat and hard time swallowing, severe bloody diarrhea in later stages, loss of appetite, abdominal pain, headache, and fever. Then there is inhalation, and this is when you inhale the spores, and this is the deadliest form of the disease. And if this happens, it's usually fatal. There is flu-like symptoms, mild chest discomfort, you're coughing up blood, painful swallowing, and nausea. And during the progression, the patient can experience shock and meningitis. So that picture there shows what the inhalation of anthrax goes in through the lungs. So 2 lungs are separated by a structure called the mediastinum, which it contains the heart, trachea, esophagus, and blood vessels. The bacterial toxins release, and then during replication in the mediastinal widening and pleural effusions, which basically is the accumulation of fluid in the pleural spaces. And then there is injection. So this method can only be recently found in Europe. This is done by drugs and people who are using infected needles. So the symptoms for this one are redness at injection site and insignificant swelling. And then as this one progresses, they can experience shock, multiple organ failure, and meningitis as well. So the physical symptoms, like we talked about, common physical symptoms are the swollen neck or lymph nodes of the affected area. And then the sores, when they are cut and infected, the area becomes a black center like the picture below. Most serious complications of anthrax is inflammation of the membrane and spinal cord, leading to massive bleeding and death. So the thing with anthrax, it was actually used as a bioterrorism technique. It was used back in 2001 in the mail. That's why mail workers are selected as part of the people who are at risk. It's airborne, so it can be found from vehicles, airplanes, mechanical aerosols. It can also be found in the food and water, but for bioterrorism, people usually put it in like an envelope or spray it out as the spores, because that is the quickest way that you can get anthrax, as well as the deadliest. So that was their normal choice of technique. So that's why mail people, you need to be careful when you're opening mail that you don't know where it's from. Please be careful. I know people can't always, think there's going to be anthrax in their mail, but it's just something to think about and just to be aware that this is a possibility and this could happen to anybody. So it can be found, I'm so sorry, but it can be mostly found in agricultural regions like Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Western Asia, Southern and Eastern Europe, and the Caribbean. It's not really found in the United States, but there are some outbreaks in wild and domestic grazing areas with cattle and deer, not really in very human populated areas anymore. So treatment, anybody you think you may have been exposed to or contracted anthrax, you need to be treated with antibiotics. This is the norm for someone who they think has contracted it, and if you have the signs and symptoms, you need to get medical attention as soon as possible to avoid progression in the disease and possible possible like long-term effects that can be left after you are cured. There is a vaccine, but it's usually only given to people who are going to be at risk or possibly being in an area where anthrax is existing. This is not normally something that you can get at like your local grocery store, like flu season or anything like that. I don't think you get anthrax vaccine when you go for your, usual shots growing up. Prevention. So, like I was saying, people, they get the vaccine if they think they're going to be in the same area as anthrax. You can also get antibiotics to avoid infection of the spores. This here lists several different types that they use. Ciprofloxacin, doxycycline, and levofloxacin are approved by the Food and Drug Administration for post-exposure in adults and children. Each of these antibiotics offer the same protection against anthrax. Anthrax spores typically take 1 to 6 days to be activated, but some spores can remain inside the body and take up to 60 days or more before they are activated. Activated spores releasing toxins or poisons that attack the body, causing the person to become sick. That's why people who have been exposed to anthrax must take antibiotics for 60 days. This will protect them from the spores in their body when they are activated. So really, after the vaccine, antibiotics is the best way to prevent and to help keep anthrax at bay. Thank you, and here are my listed resources. I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation and learned something about anthrax. Thank you.